Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. You know, the little pouch on the front of your waders? I bet that'll hold some corn for you if you want to throw it in there. I don't know if it's in the regs or not.
What makes you think it doesn't already have some remnants from last time in it?
Yeah, but that corn, man, that's got to be aflatoxin heavy. Decreases the fish bite, you know?
Inducing aflatoxicosis in trout streams.
Oh, man. Actually, I just found a paper on that. Let me see.
All right, so what are we talking about today?
What indeed? Well, it's not trout fishing.
No. Well, we were talking about trout fishing, but now we're talking about hardwoods.
Yeah, so we've both been getting a whole bunch of questions, and it is that time of year when it is on the mind of many.
It's a great time to sit in a nice stand of oaks right now.
Yeah, if you're sitting in a deer stand, you may be doing it right now while you're listening to us. But yeah, a lot of folks have been asking about oak masting, how to manage stands, hardwood stands, bottom one and up one. We've been getting tons of questions about that. Also, we've gotten a few things about how important oaks are to turkeys. So I think we have kind of collectively decided that we should dig in on that topic and let's have a multi-part series here where we talk about oaks, the biology of oaks, the importance of oaks to turkeys, how to manage them, all those sorts of things, try to really cover those topics. I do think it's a pretty important one, and I think our audience does too, based on the number of questions and comments we've gotten related to it.
Yeah, and to any of our listeners that have, you know, those friends, or maybe they don't even want to call them friends, but they keep them at arm's length as acquaintances because they're deer hunters only. You know, this might be some good content to share with them as well. Even though we're on Turkey Science, they're going to learn a lot about hardwoods and oaks specifically, and acorns, how to make more of them, how to manage hardwood stands, all stuff that's very relevant, you know, to both species.
Yeah. Well, both of us also have a fair amount of experience on the subject matter, not just hunting and observing wildlife using them, deer and turkey for sure, but also research experience.
Yeah.
So, well, let's jump in. Where do you want to start with this thing?
Yeah. So maybe I'm taking us too far back, but I think that this is something
way back.
We're throwing it way back. But it's something that I always talk about in my habitat class because I like to give my students kind of a historical frame of reference. And we talk all the time about the importance of oak mast, of acorns, to wildlife, and especially for game species. Although there was a Massachusetts study back in the 90s that documented use of acorns by over 90 species of wildlife. So these, although we oftentimes think about the importance of acorns through the lens of deer and turkey management, they're a critical part of the ecosystem. And their level of importance has only increased following the functional extinction of the American chestnut from the landscape. And so the reason that the functional extinction of the American chestnut increased the importance of oak mast is because the American chestnut was such a reliable producer of mast, of chestnuts. And part of the reason for that is because it flowered after most chance of frost had passed, whereas
Mhm.
a lot of our oaks still flower in relatively early spring, sometimes before Easter,
Mhm.
and they're subject to getting bitten by that frost, which definitely affects, their production, depending on if they're in the red oak or the white oak group on down
Right.
the line, that which group they belong to is going to affect that timing of that effect. Did I
Yeah,
just say
I think
effect too
that's
many times in one sentence?
something like that,
Two or
yes.
three?
I don't know how effective it was.
I'm not being an
Uh,
effective communicator today.
yeah, so I have mulled this over a lot. I teach about the same thing in habitat management here, and my course is kind of, designed to have a discussion-heavy
Mhm.
focus when we're all in person, and we focus a lot on the chestnut. That was such a dramatic change to the hardwood forests, in really, really short amount of time, and the masting on they are very consistent
Mhm.
relative to oaks generally. So, year to year, you wouldn't have as much variation in mast availability from the chestnuts, and I think that's a pretty important thing to take into consideration. Also, the nut is relatively high quality.
Yeah, it's, nutritional content is as good as or better than many species of oaks,
That's
depending
right.
on which
Yeah,
species you're talking about.
yeah, and uh, I think that it's important for us to think about that, and particularly in the context of what you were saying now, we are dominated by oak in many of those same forests,
Mhm.
and that those wildlife species that historically would have used chestnut now are relying on mast from oaks
Yeah,
instead.
and I think it's easy to kinda wave our hands and be like, "The American chestnut was very important." But I oftentimes pitch it to my students like this: can you imagine if tomorrow or maybe, next year, what if what if all the white oaks were gone? And the loss of the American chestnut was even more significant than that, I
Hmm.
would argue.
I agree, and like you said, it may not have been overnight, but it was pretty
It
fast.
was pretty fast.
So there's been a lot of cool work going on trying to restore it.
Yeah,
For one, I wouldn't mind seeing, you know, I wanna see what how those things function again. I think that'll be cool.
absolutely.
We've got, the 15th, 16th.
That'd be ripe for some wildlife research.
Yeah, I agree, man. I would be all over that. So if you're a funding agency out there and you're wanting to do some some chestnut research, no,
So one of the other things that I wanted to get at before we moved on from chestnuts is I made a teaser post on Instagram and then shared it to Facebook also this week, kind of
mhm,
teasing this episode series that we're about to jump into. And in that post, I mentioned something about the importance of the loss of the chestnut and the role that it used to play in wildlife ecology. And I got an interesting comment on that post by one of our listeners that asked if turkeys ate chestnuts.
mhm,
And I figured they probably did, but I wasn't sure. So I went to the literature to try to figure it out and came across this really cool paper by Billy Mincer, who apparently you've had some
mhm,
interaction with.
yeah.
You know him.
Really awesome guy. He worked at UT for years and years and years and, had a influence over me in multiple ways, but one thing that I think our audience would really appreciate is it is hard to find someone that's more obsessed with turkeys than that guy.
Yeah,
He really loved them,
yeah,
and I do too,
and it's
and
evident from this study.
yeah, and some of the things that he did really kind of influenced me. I was telling you earlier that are relevant to the study, so you can go ahead with it now.
Do you want to provide that whole background, or just jump right into the results? You think?
Well, whatever you wanna do.
Okay, so the the major take home and to answer that listener's question, he did compare use of chestnuts by wild turkeys to other hard mast, and they found that turkeys accepted chestnuts as readily as acorns. So They
Mhm.
definitely
Yes.
they definitely highly prefer chestnuts. There was a little bit of information in there that talked about how earlier in the study, as the flock that he was testing this on became accustomed to the chestnuts, they weren't initially taking that many of them, but that quickly changed over time as they kind of
Mhm.
acclimated to that new food item.
And that's pretty typical just for those out there. I've done a ton of work with diet selection,
Hmm.
and new items are often not viewed as food, and a lot of these species, like turkeys, kinda sample things in their environment, and once they get that digestive feedback or whatever mechanisms kicking in, once they realize that it is food and it's good,
Yeah.
that, you'll start to see once that they get through that threshold of acceptance, you'll start to see that settle in a preference level.
And people see that a lot of times when they plant new food plot species for deer.
Mhm.
It takes the deer a
Yep.
little while to acclimate to that.
Yep, that's a great example.
But to share a few other findings from that study, just because they're interesting, turkeys tended to prefer small diameter acorns. So, southern red, willow, oak, water oak, pin oak, cherry bark, nuttall, shumard, sawtooth. Which that one sawtooth surprised me because I think about sawtooth as being a pretty big acorn.
Mhm.
Um, and and regular white oaks were totally consumed in nearly every feeding trial that they did, whereas larger acorns of northern red oak and swamp white oaks were totally consumed. So, meaning the pile or the portion that he put out in a given feeding period, they those larger acorns were only consumed in less than half of the trials. So, a little bit reduced preference for those larger acorn species.
Mhm.
Also interesting, he noted that pine seeds were readily consumed and the preference of those pine seeds was equal to acorns. I think an important distinction to make there is that he'd already separated them from the cone, so they're freely available, which happens in the woods too,
Mhm.
so not to totally discount that. And one thing that kind of surprised me is that turkeys also ate pecans.
Yeah, that is a little bit surprising to me.
I would not have expected that.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about all the big pecan orchards that I've driven through in like South Georgia, South
Mhm.
Alabama, and I don't ever really recall seeing a lot of turkeys out in those.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, a lot of the varieties of pecans that you'd see in those orchard, I think of that nut
Mm,
being a little bit too large. I
yeah,
mean, sort of similar to, the swamp white oaks and northern red that he was testing in there. I mean, they would definitely rival that. But I also have seen pecans that are quite a bit smaller.
right,
So I could see it. It doesn't surprise me that much that they would eat them if they're small enough that they can intake them.
sure.
Uh,
One other. Oh, go ahead. If you're, I was going to make
w-
one little other fun fact.
about the Menzer study, or are you moving on from it?
Moving on that next point.
Okay, before we move on from it, I was going to add a little tidbit. So one of the things that really influenced me about Menzer is his passion for turkeys, but also the approach, which I think this study we decided is probably one of the more formal things that he was doing. I don't think he published the other part, but it kind of blew my mind at the time. And it led me to a lot of diet selection work that I've done
Hmm.
since. It was definitely an influential point in my life. But I can remember him talking about trying to figure out what colors they were attracted to or avoided. So he had
Hmm.
like a group of tame turkeys around the house,
Hmm.
and he's like out there feeding them jelly beans, trying to figure out which color was their favorite. He's doing all these things, and I appreciate so much that curiosity. And that guy, he
Absolutely.
just loved them.
What? So, what color did they prefer?
I don't remember any details about it, honestly. It just stuck in my head like, oh, this is how we could start to get at unraveling some of these things. And I've posted a whole bunch of diet selection type studies that we've published over the years with various graduate students, where some of them were actually acorn selection studies. Like I did one recently I think I made a post about how exposing acorns to fire might affect selection of them.
It actually
Uh,
increased selection, didn't it?
for some species, yeah.
That's cool.
So some species of oaks and some species of wildlife prefer the charred acorn that's been through a prescribed fire over the ones that are not exposed.
Well, I prefer roasted nuts myself, so
Yeah.
I can't fault them for
Well,
that.
so but thing like so I can't remember exactly the details of it now. I have a really good post kind of characterizing all that. If you want to look at it online, and I think we have the video on the YouTube channel. But some squirrels that were going to cache the acorn, they they didn't like the charred ones, which makes sense.
Yeah,
They want something that's going to store for a long time.
right. You wanna
So,
know
but anyway,
something you wanna know something funny about that?
what's that?
I had a listener reach out to me recently, in a DM, and he asked me something about he asked me something about, "Do you have information on that study or that something somebody was talking about where, uh, wildlife," I don't even remember if it was turkey specific or not, but, preferred acorns that had been burned in a prescribed fire? And, I responded to him in a very politically correct manner, but when I first saw him ask that question, I was like, "Who the hell would even research that?"
This guy.
I didn't think it was a thing.
Yeah,
I was like, "This guy dug something up somewhere in some
yeah.
random article, and it was you."
Well,
It
that's funny.
it's
I
not the
have a
only
couple.
it's not the only time you and I have had differences in opinion of what's interesting to study, and that's
Yeah.
fine.
Well, I think it becomes really interesting because it's a barrier to using fire in the fall.
Sure.
That's why we did that.
Okay. That makes sense.
And the work has been done to look at how it affects viability of acorns,
Mhm.
but our point was that it might affect the wildlife attraction,
Mhm.
and especially one of the results from it is that almost all the acorns eaten by deer in the trial were burned.
That's cool.
So I was like, okay, well, now we've got a good reason for a deer hunter out there to use prescribed fire in the fall. And if it gets them to use fire, I think we're making progress because of the benefits of fire for wildlife habitat in general. So that's where that came from.
I
If
agree. I agree,
a
that's
whole bunch of
interesting.
people were, okay, I get burning in the fall is good, but I don't want to,
Right.
damage my acorn crop.
Yeah. My intent
So
in sharing that was to be funny, not to put you on the defensive, but
well, I didn't mean to be on the defensive, but I
but
do think
no,
it is
I
a
follow
relevant question to.
I follow your rationale.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think that is a good point, though. That's a reason why we need a bunch of researchers because we definitely have differences of opinion, even you and I, where we often align in the way we think.
yes.
We also have enough differences where we go down different lines of inquiry, which it has intrinsically a lot of value
Yeah,
having
it does,
having scientists do that.
for sure. Yeah, especially, I mean, you're wired to think of those more creative questions where I'm wired to think of the more direct, approaches of, let's
Mhm.
see, how this management action affects X affects Y.
Mhm.
But definitely the way that you have that line of thinking prompts new ideas in me sometimes that lead to
Mhm.
direct type research as well.
Yeah, and that's reciprocated. I mean, I think it's a really valuable part of this whole thing is that we have many minds trying to tackle questions, and it's also value from the audience that I
Yeah.
get a
Oh,
lot because I
absolutely.
get
Y'all's feedback prompts ideas
yeah
in us all the time
yeah
of,
I
you
get
know,
questions that prompt a completely new way of thinking about things pretty commonly.
well, I mean, that's, for example, that fire and fire surrogate study that I'm starting up
Hmm.
was partially motivated by all the listener questions we got about how do I manage turkey habitat in places where I can't burn.
Hmm.
So, I mean, we get
Yep.
listener feedback all the time that we're making a difference to them, but they're making a difference to us as well.
Yeah, as it should be.
All right.
Anyway,
So
all right,
we're
you
going to
got a
talk.
fun fact.
Yeah, there's one
Yeah,
more fun fact I was going to share, and we're going to talk about this a lot more in future episodes. This one's going to be more about the biology of the oaks themselves. But just as a kind of a introductory factoid, there was that same Massachusetts study that I referenced earlier. They also found that over 50% of the diets of deer and turkeys during fall, winter, and spring were comprised of northern red oak acorns.
of northern red oak or
Of
just
I'm
red oak?
sorry, of red oak acorns.
Okay, I was
So
gonna say I thought you just said they don't like northern red.
no, of red oak acorns. So acorns belonging to the red oak group, and I think that this kind of introduces our next topic as well, and that's talking about some important biological differences in species in the red oak group and the white oak group. And just as an
Yeah.
FYI, that is
So wait a
actually that's a subgenus classification.
yeah. So before we get into the differences in red and white, what everybody out there knows is that the white oak is the better one, right?
Right.
Wildlife like white oak. And now that is it took me a minute for my wheels to catch up. I've been spinning there for a minute after you said that. The In that study, deer and turkey's diet was dominated by red oaks.
Hmm.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
Not white oaks. They probably had some white oak too,
Yes, they did.
but their study shows over 50% of the diet, which I think you're familiar with some of the historical studies quantifying the proportion of the deer diet, at least
Hmm.
that was acorns. I think at some times of the year, it's something like 80% or 85% of the diet could be acorns.
Hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's
Something like
high. I
that.
don't remember that exact value, but one caveat that I was going to put on the Massachusetts study, as well as you're probably thinking about some of the North Georgia stuff that was done. Am I wrong?
No, that's right.
Okay. Is that those results are in landscapes that are dominated by oak hickory forest.
Yes,
So not a lot of alternative forage available within a deer's reach.
that's right. And I think that's an important caveat. And in those systems, it can be up to 80+% of their diet.
Right.
That does not mean it is always 80% of
Right.
their diet.
Right.
That's a good point. I mean, obviously, we have turkeys in places where there's very little hard mast,
Yes. Yep.
or at least very few
And
acorns.
deer too.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to keep it on turkeys, but
Well,
you keep
almost
shrugging.
almost everybody here at least shoots some deer for meat, right?
Yeah. And they may be on a deer stand right now
Yeah.
listening to us. So,
We can't throw too much shade at them. All right. So, red oak subgenus versus white oak subgenus. Tell me
yeah.
about differences.
Well, a lot of people are aware of different characteristics of the acorns themselves in
Mhm.
terms of their relative nutritional value. And people are probably immediately thinking about tannins.
Yep.
So, when I'm teaching about this, that's usually where the students are starting.
Mhm.
But we immediately take a step back and think about the biology of the species and why we might see some of those differences. So, just to put it plainly, the relative nutrition of species can vary quite a bit, but we have this tendency where white oaks are less defended,
Mhm.
in particular, than red oaks. That's very consistent.
Defense against herbivory, which would prevent the
Yeah,
tree from sprouting, and that's what the tree's trying to
right.
do when it produces acorns is to
Exactly.
reproduce.
Exactly. And it's really important for the seed, principally first, to not be destroyed.
Right.
And then secondarily to that, to get buried.
Mhm.
So a squirrel caching it or a corvid caching it. Those are fundamental processes in the oak's life cycle.
Mhm.
Don't get crushed, but it often is from a conditional mutualism between a species like a squirrel. So the squirrels eat a lot of acorns, but they also bury some of them. And some of the ones they bury, they forget about them, or the squirrel dies and it never gets recovered, and you
Poor
end up with a
squirrel.
new tree. and those events are disproportionately important to the physiology of the reproduction or the fitness of the oak.
Yeah.
Those few seeds that don't ever get recovered from the cache, those are the ones that turn into the majority of the new trees.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about defense, we're often talking principally about tannins,
Mm-hmm.
and the red oaks tend to have more tannins than the white oaks. There are several reasons why that probably is the case, and I find that there's some misconception around that uh, of why that might be.
Can I lay out my hypothesis and you tell me if I'm right or wrong?
Sure.
Because you've probably dug way deeper into this than I have. But another attribute of red oaks versus white oaks that affects their wildlife use and why you need both categories,
Hmm.
right, is that white oaks generally germinate shortly after they hit the ground, that
Hmm.
fall, winter, whereas red oaks germinate much later into winter, early spring.
Yeah, they usually need to be cold stratified.
Right. And so my hypothesis would be that because red oaks have to lay around for a lot longer before they germinate, that they need to be less palatable to wildlife because there's a longer duration of availability during which they could be consumed. Whereas white oaks that germinate quickly, they don't have to quote unquote defend themselves for as long of a period. Right or
So
wrong?
you're kind of in between.
Okay. You're
So
letting me down. You're letting me down softly here.
well, I think that is part of it for sure. The acorn, and what I mean by that is the acorn has a much longer period of time that it has to defend itself
Mm-hmm.
before it's ready to germinate.
Mm-hmm.
But what the part of it that you focused on is just a short part of it.
Okay.
So one of the key differences between red oaks and white oaks, which is also a key reason why you want both, is the red oaks typically they go from flowering in the spring through a growing season, so through the summer into that fall,
I didn't
and
even
the
think about them
acorn,
staying on the tree for longer too.
yeah, the acorn continues to grow for an entire another year.
Yeah.
So we go through two growing seasons. So if it flowers in May of 23, we'd go through fall of 23, still actively growing, all the way to May of 24.
Mm-hmm.
And then it would come around, and maybe in October or of
24.
October, November, whenever of 24
Right.
is when that acorn would fall, as
Right.
opposed to a white oak, where if it was fertilized, that flower, in May of 23,
Right.
the acorn would ripen and fall off of the tree in the fall of 23.
Right.
So there's a couple of important things. So one, there has been some work done on this. It seems like that tannin defense is more for insects than it is for wildlife.
Ah.
But
Because
probably
we
not
do lose,
exclusively.
and people may not be aware of this, but we lose a large number of acorns on the
Yeah,
tree to insects.
yeah, principally things like acorn weevils.
Mm-hmm.
So you probably seen this in the woods if you are paying attention. You'll see a bunch of dead acorns
Mm-hmm.
that either the tree shed or, well, actually, most of the time it is that the tree shed it.
You pick
So it
them
might
up and
have
they're
gotten
real
all
light
the
and
way
dull
to,
colored.
yeah, it'll be laying there dull, and it really commonly will have a little hole drilled in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the weevil escaping.
Yeah.
So, uh, yeah, it's probably the tannins are playing a big role in defending it for longer from that insect
Yeah.
because it's got to go a whole another season through.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it isn't playing a role on the other side as well. I
Right.
don't think this is well researched, to be honest with you.
Yeah. I was well aware of the difference in timing of the masting cycle between reds and whites, but I never thought about factoring that in to the
Hmm.
palatability
Yeah,
as well. You know, how that
yeah,
factored into the
for
palatability
those
difference.
weevils.
Yeah.
So when you look at the relative proportion of acorns that get lost to insects, that's also it happens. So when we're talking about a phenomenon called mass seeding, all that means is that the oaks, or a lot of plants do this. The one I think about most is oaks. They kind of synchronize when they produce. So we have this synchrony in, particularly when you stay within a subgenus. So the red oaks tend to, across species even, synchronize which year they produce in.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of leads me to what my point was about wanting both, because the flowers this year are producing acorns and the red oaks in a different year than the flowers this year from white oaks.
Mm-hmm.
The factors that affect flowering this year would, if you only had white oaks, either make it or break it. So it's either going to be a really awesome year or a really poor year. And when you have both, now they aren't exposed to the same conditions at flowering as what's producing the mast. You tend to flatten out that variability from year to year. So you don't have that boom bust. It's not as dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a principal reason to have both. So I don't know if you wanted to get that far into it
No,
this
that's good
fast,
stuff. No, I
but
like it. And to build on that, I've got a really cool figure from a study that I show in my habitat class to really drive home this point. You
yeah.
probably use the same one, but it's these 5 species of southern Appalachian oaks that we talk about all the time because there was a lot of work done in that area. Downs and McQuilkin were the
Mhm,
first ones to do it, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But you can actually see, I think they had 3 species in the red oak subgenus and 2 species in the white oak subgenus, and it was over like a 4 or 5 year period. And you can
mhm,
see that there were years where the red oaks had a pretty good year, but the white oaks did nothing, and years where the white oaks had a good year or even a great year, and the red oaks did nothing. So they're filling in
mhm,
those nutritional gaps for species like
yeah.
turkeys that are reliant on acorns.
So if you only had one or the other, you'd have this huge boom bust. Like everybody's doing well or everybody's poor, and then you hear of a what's the term that people use? Like a banner year,
Yeah, bumper crop.
a bumper crop. There you go. That's what I was looking for. So you hear about those bumper crop years. Sometimes they align,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly when there's been multiple years of failure, like where
Yeah.
the flowering was really poor in either. Well, sometimes it's the flowering was poor, the flower timing was poor for both groups several years in a row, and then it all of a sudden is good 2 years in a row. That's when you end up with that huge bumper crop,
Mm-hmm. Makes it
because
hard to
now
hunt.
everybody had good conditions at the time of flowering to synchronize on that same year
Yeah.
across white oaks and red oaks, and then you can really blow the doors off of it, and that happens about once a decade or so usually.
Yeah. Good for the critters, not good for the hunters when that
Yeah, it makes
happens.
things difficult, but man, if you get a hold of a of a animal, it's gonna be fat,
Oh yeah.
you know?
Uh, oh yeah.
So, yeah, I hope I didn't, get ahead of you on your notes. I know you kinda planned out some
No, you're
things
good.
that you wanted to talk about.
You've made me less wooden about that over time.
Yeah. So, what, do you wanna talk about some of the other differences in more detail, like the nutritional differences? I know that you dug around and
We
were looking into
can.
some of that.
I don't know how relevant that is. I mean, in general, red oaks tend to have a little bit higher fat content
Mhm.
than white oaks do. I don't know anything about nutritional content beyond that. Maybe you do.
Well, I think the most relevant thing is probably that tannin level,
Mm-hmm.
and that probably influences the acceptability. Another thing, one point I did wanna make, the same student that worked on the diet selection with the fire, that you said was complete nonsense, uh, he also did another experiment which I found really, really interesting, and we basically had come to this realization that he was gonna have to simulate masting,
Mm-hmm.
and he did that by collecting, like, 75,000 acorns or something from Shumard oak, and it just happened that Shumard oak was the only oak that was producing that year, so it was a complete mass failure across the board. So you remember when we were talking about the bumper crop? The same thing can be true where you have
Mhm.
multiple years in a row that are really poor conditions for flowering. You could have no mast anyway, and that was this year. So we decided he's going to simulate a mast year in a year where basically it was complete failure across the board. But Shoemarge, for some reason, and around Starkville, were doing awesome.
Mhm.
So he borrowed a bunch of equipment from the Mossy Oak nursery over there, Native Nurseries, and went and collected 75,000 acorns.
Good
And
grief.
he took them to the study site where there weren't any Shoemards producing. Like it was basically no acorns.
Mhm.
And he went to parent trees that he had identified that were going to be his target tree, and then basically put down thousands of acorns that he calculated based on the canopy, like how many
Yeah.
they would produce in a good year. And there were a bunch of cool things that came from that. But the thing I wanted to point out here that's relevant to your comment earlier, when he simulated those basically in November, which we got a really cool video on this. If you want to see the data, you can go see it online on YouTube or whatever. But he put thousands of acorns out in a few week period, trying to simulate the pattern and masting that you'd see from a typical oak, and then monitor deer response to that. And the response was delayed for about 2 months. So he put them out in early November, and then we had the peak in use of those acorns by deer in mid January.
Hmm.
So, that led me to think about the white oak, red oak thing in a different way. It isn't necessarily that deer or turkeys don't like them as much. It may not be the right time when they fall for them to
Yeah.
eat them.
Yeah.
And we don't know if that's because they decrease in tannins before they start getting ready to germinate, or if it's because the animals are getting hard up at late in
Yeah.
the winter. But typically, when a white oak acorn falls onto the ground, it germinates relatively fast.
Yeah.
It's like within a couple weeks, usually that thing germinates. So they basically have to take advantage of that when it falls,
Yeah.
as opposed to a red oak. That thing's going to sit around, through the season all the way into the spring often.
Yeah.
So it's not as critical for them to take advantage of it right away. And I found that really interesting. And until we did it experimentally and then monitored their
Mhm.
reaction to it, and remember, this was a mass failure year. It
Yeah.
wasn't that they were eating white oaks instead. There weren't any.
Mhm.
They just didn't eat them until it got time to eat them.
Well, that's really interesting, and that's why even beyond just talking about acorns, I always try to remind my habitat class when I'm teaching the wildlife use of a particular plant, like just because this is highly preferred or this is moderately preferred or this is less preferred doesn't mean that it inherently has more or less value for wildlife, because sometimes oftentimes, especially with mast, both soft and hard mast, we really see this where those lower preference items fill nutritional gaps when the higher preference items are not available.
Hmm.
So, I mean, this is talking about the whole ecology of the system and how this all works and fits together, which is really cool.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's some principles here that we can learn from, like having a diversity of oak species in your stands it has value because of that. It not only kind of stabilizes mass production across years and over time as well, which I think you have some
Yeah.
interesting stuff in here about that, and we can get into it. But that diversity begets stability, but also in uh, multiple ways is it begetting it. So from a nutritional standpoint, both in the nutrition it's providing, but also in the timing it's providing it,
Right.
right? So the way to cover all those gaps is through diversity, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess we can jump on into Downs and McQuilkin, which is the study from the 40s. Good
Yeah.
information, even though it was from the 40s, that I shared in my Facebook and Instagram post this week.
Yeah,
So,
which we can cut that figure right back into here if
sure.
folks didn't see or they can go look at your post. It's good too.
Yeah.
But if
So,
they're listening on YouTube, you can see the graph.
they looked at various masting characteristics of northern red oak, white oak, black oak, chestnut oak, and scarlet oak. And this work was done in, I believe, North Georgia, Western North Carolina, and Eastern Tennessee. Because I think it was, I didn't write that down for Downs and McQuilkin, but I think Greenberg, uh, their paper in 2000 published off a lot of that same data, and I know that's where Greenberg's work came from. That's where their study areas were from.
Mm-hmm.
But do you want to talk about size when they start producing first, or do you want to talk about relative composition of good and poor producers by species? What do you think we should
I
take
think we
first?
should talk about the size first.
Okay.
So when I was talking about it being important through time,
Mhm.
I think that is the relevant thing here.
Right. So the best predictor from that study of when a member of any of those species would start producing was diameter at breast height. And specifically, most of those species start producing at about 10 inches in diameter at breast height. And we say that because for those of you that don't recognize that term, including a couple of people in the post I made this week, that is a standardized height at which we measure tree diameters across forestry and wildlife studies.
Mhm.
So most of them start producing around 10 inches dBH. That's how I'll refer to it going forward. But at that size, we're only talking about a few hundred acorns per tree. So, like for scarlet oak, around that size, based on their data, a 10-inch scarlet oak would produce about 500 acorns. Um, and then production starts to ramp up once trees hit about 14 inches in diameter. That's when they really start to kind of go into this exponential acorn production phase. And
Mhm.
so, going back to the scarlet oak example again, scarlet oak increased acorn production until it hit about 20 inches in diameter, and it peaked there at about 3,400 acorns per tree.
Mhm.
White oak increased until 28 inches. Oh, let me back up for a second. So scarlet oak, it hit that peak, and then based on their data, that peak of acorn production was maintained. It plateaued. There was
Mhm.
no increase further. There was no decrease once it hit that peak. In contrast,
No matter how big the tree got?
no matter how big the tree got, and they measured
I didn't
their
realize that.
figure went all the way up to 38 inches dBH.
So that's a beast.
That's a big honker. All
Yeah, that's
right.
good.
So white oak, a little bit different trend. Increased until about 28 inches in diameter, at which time it peaked with around 2,300 acorns per tree. And then it decreased. It decreased in acorn production once it got larger than about 28 inches. So, for example, at its peak, on average, a white oak tree that was 28 inches would be producing 2,300 acorns, and one that was 38 inches, so 10 inches larger in diameter, would only be producing about 1,400 acorns per tree. So, a little bit
Mhm.
more than half of what it was doing at its peak. You want me to keep going through all the species and we'll kind of talk about the implications of this?
Yeah,
Black oak,
it's good stuff.
Black oak had a linear increase in production all the way up to 38 inches. Apparently, they couldn't find any black oaks larger than that. Surprise, surprise. But it peaked at about 2,300 acorns per tree. Northern red oak increased until 20 inches, so it reached its peak at a smaller diameter than these other species that we've talked about so far. And it peaked at about 1,500 acorns per tree. And then it declined to less than 400 acorns per tree at 38 inches was their projection,
Mhm.
which is kind of incredible to me when you think about um, a northern red oak that's over 30 inches in diameter only producing a few hundred acorns. That's what it was producing back when it was a 10-inch tree.
Mhm.
The last
Yeah,
one that
that
they
is
looked at,
crazy. It's such a big tree.
oh, I know. And the last one that I looked at, or that they looked at in that study, was chestnut oak. It increased until 20 inches, peaked at only about 700 acorns per average for an individual tree, and then it maintained that level of production as far as their projections went out.
Mhm.
So we've got to kind of consolidate that information. Um, Scarlet oak, when it reached its peak, was producing the greatest number of acorns per tree on average at about 3,400. White oak and black oak were right behind that at about 2,300 per tree. And then northern red oak was 1,500 and chestnut oak was 700. But an important point to make, I think, kind of the next topic we're going to go into is that among these species, we have differences in the average number of poor producers versus good producers.
Mhm. One thing I wanted to add to this, I went and grabbed it because I made a post about it based on the same information years ago,
Yeah.
like 2 years ago. We can cut it in if you're watching on YouTube so you can see this, or you can find it on Instagram if you want to. Uh, I I got kind of curious based on all these numbers. If we had a fully stocked oak stand,
Mm,
which turns out is about 100 trees per acre, and then did the math on it, we're talking about in a good year, we're doing pretty good. Uh, we're looking at about 300,000 acorns per acre.
wow.
That's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
5,000 pounds of food per acre.
5,000 pounds
Yeah.
per acre. That's
Yeah,
impressive.
and I knew that's based on, Mariah Bogus was the graduate student that
Yeah.
worked on that oak study, and, he we had to figure out how many acorns make a pound
Hmm.
because it was so tedious for him to try to count all them acorns he was picking up. So we started doing it by the pound.
So you think you want to
Uh,
be a wildlife graduate student?
yeah, yeah. I mean, he took it like a champ. He's like, "Okay, I guess that's what I'm gonna have to do."
Yeah.
And, so anyway, that the sheer I mean, we're talking about per acre, 5,000 pounds per acre in a good
Hmm.
year of food. Like, that's substantial,
That is substantial.
which I guess if it was a pie, we'd be splitting that pie a bunch of different ways, right? Because
Yeah,
every wildlife species out there wants to eat it.
that's right.
So, but it makes sense why that would be in some of these mature upland oak stands with diverse, fully stocked. That's a
Hmm.
ton, literally a couple tons of food per
Couple
acre,
tons. Ton. Yeah.
uh,
Two and a
two and a
half.
half tons per acre. So,
That's simple
pretty
math. Even I can
incredible.
get my head around.
Yeah. How many Alabamas?
how, how much does one Alabama weigh?
Yeah. Somebody could probably answer that.
All right. So we talked about those patterns in production, and this isn't something that we're going to get into detail on right now. But hoping that you guys are going to they're going to follow us throughout this entire series. We're going to be getting back to that later on when we specifically talk about management, because with the knowledge that some trees decline in production past a certain point, that can give us some flexibility in management of oak forest to meet
Mhm.
some other objectives. So maybe we want to
Yeah.
remove some of those trees that are past their prime in order to accomplish other management objectives.
Mhm. And so can some of this individual variation influence how we select
As
trees. So,
can the individual variation, which was the next thing we wanted to get into. So, in general, for most oak species, about 50% of the population is a poor producer and 50% are good producers. And the way that that is oftentimes determined in these studies is they look at the overall production by species over about a 5 year period. They get that average of those ups and down years in
mhm,
masting, and then they look at the number of individuals that were above that average and the number of individuals that were below that average. Okay. So there's two really standout exceptions to that rule from this particular work on these five species, and that's chestnut oak, of which greater than 50% of the individuals in a population are categorized as poor producers. I think that actual number, I don't know if you remember it, I didn't write it down, but I think it's like 70%
mhm.
of
Yeah,
chestnut
it's
oaks are
huge.
poor producers. And I think in that study, 8 out of the this was another study I'm thinking about. It was a longer term study, but I think they said that like 8 out of 12 years there was a complete acorn failure in chestnut oaks. So chestnut oaks are
Mhm.
a very, very unreliable producer.
The interesting thing about that to me, I have a student, she's just finishing up, Kelsey Domini, who's been tracking mass production on a different suite of oaks that we don't have much data on them in the published.
Mhm.
Water oak, swamp chestnut oak, and
Mhm.
laurel oak.
Yeah.
And in her study so far, we're the third year in, and the swamp chestnut oak also seems to be like that,
Mm.
where it's just so inconsistent.
Right.
But the other thing about swamp chestnut oak and the selection stuff that I have done with deer, that one usually comes out number one.
Right.
And it did in her study when we were looking at deer use of oaks within her study area. The swamp chestnut oak was definitely driving selection,
Mhm.
even though it was relatively low abundance. And uh, 2 out of the 3 years is basically a mass failure.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the other year where they did not fail, they failed anyway because a hurricane hit and it knocked all of them out of the tree. So, which was
Man.
this year. Uh, but yeah, it seems to hold true. And also, some people out there may not realize that chestnut oak and swamp chestnut oak are different
Right.
species.
Right.
So, but I just thought that was interesting, and it fits with my observations that from hunting, where if you could find a swamp chestnut oak that was raining them down, you better hang a stand right there
Mhm.
because it's going to be attractive.
Absolutely.
But it's so inconsistent.
Yeah. Yep. Well, so we talked about good and poor producers, but just hearing, 50% this, 60% that probably doesn't resonate that much with people.
Hmm.
Do you want to share some of that information on white oaks as an example from that paper you published way back in
Way
'09?
back when, that was
In
my
the
first paper.
in the early days? I figured it had to be close to it because I started graduate school in '08, and I knew
Yeah,
that we were right there about the same time. So,
yeah. I started in '07, and we had started the white oak study, which now is published with 10 years of data.
hmm.
So it was the follow up to this study. This was the original paper from that same study. And in this Lashley et al. 2009, we also partnered with Katie Greenberg and got data from her white oak study that was ongoing at the same time. And we published them all together. Uh, so I guess the follow up study, the Brook et al. Paper, which I made a post on just recently, that one only had a part of these oaks that were in this study, I guess,
Hmm.
because Greenberg's oaks were not included in the longer term thing. That study was eye opening to me. I have always been really interested in oak masting, and as a deer and turkey enthusiast, I've always just been fascinated with it. And my eyes were opened with that study. First of all, because I had to count tens of thousands of acres. I mean, it was just takes forever, and especially when it's cold and you've got these little baskets under the trees. In that case, they were made out of like jersey mesh,
Yeah,
which Craig Harper's wife, I think, sewed them so that they'd fit on like a
sounds
hula
about
hoop,
right.
and that we were putting on posts,
Yeah,
out in the woods. So we're doing it a little different now than we did then.
yeah,
Now we're using a PVC frame and like mesh netting that you'd put up in your screened-in porch or something. But anyway, um, I learned so much from that after really sitting down and going through the data and figuring out what I actually saw once I did all that. About one third of the oaks are very good producers. And when I say one third, talking about, roughly 30%, 33% are producing 75% of the mast. So they are carrying the weight.
I remember the first time I ever heard that statistic, it was Craig was presenting on the data, and I was floored.
Yeah.
A third of the it was white oak specific, right?
Mhm.
A
Yeah,
third
this
of
was
the
all white oaks.
a third of the white oaks produced 75% of
Yeah.
the acorns, and that was at 2 different sites.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a site in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina.
So it wasn't like
2
some
states.
weird deal specific to that site. I mean, this
That's
was
right.
consistent.
Yeah, both sites show that same pattern, and, it also is very similar after 10 years.
Yeah.
So, I think that's a pretty solid statistic on white oaks.
And then you look at it that other way,
Yeah, so about
half of the trees.
half of the trees were poor producers, and the interesting thing about it to me, we're not measuring every bit of the canopy. It's like we've got these square meter,
Mhm.
think about a little over a yard on each side if you can't think in meters, uh, baskets underneath the canopy, and we're counting what falls into that basket.
Right.
So I can't prove that some of those trees never produced an acorn, but I can say we had some trees, and I think it actually was over the entire 10 years that did not ever have an acorn fall in that basket.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that to me is pretty remarkable. So some trees literally we couldn't prove that they ever produced an acorn,
Yeah.
but half of them were yielding, yeah, only about 10 or 15% of the acorns from year to year.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember because I've looked at so many of these studies in the past couple days, but reading in one of them, it said that there were some trees that produced acorns every single year of the study, and some that didn't
Yeah,
produce any years of the study.
yeah. So I think we talked about that in that 2009 study. Some of them never produced acorns.
Yeah,
Some of them produced them every year.
yeah,
Those almost all, without fail, are on the good side and or excellent producers. So I think we categorize them into 4
hmm,
groups. So the excellent producers are very consistent with white oak. What we've kind of we looked at the data all kinds of different ways, trying to figure out how to identify which ones would be good, and
hmm,
essentially, if a tree produced an acorn out of the 3 years, or maybe it was 2 out of the 3 years, it was relatively reliably categorized in the good or excellent.
which is very important to know for management.
Yeah, so we'll get into that in more detail because I have some follow up information on how you can go about that from our ongoing work now. Because I now have launched a second or a follow up to this. It's going to be an 8 year long study, which we're
Hmm.
3 years into, and we're doing some interesting things related to this that's trying to advance past what we've learned from these other ones.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, essentially half of the oaks are just taking up space.
Yeah. I mean,
They're not
the
producing in
exact
mass.
statistic that I wrote down was half of the white oaks were poor producers, meaning, and you translate that into actual yield, they yielded 10% of the acorns collected.
Mhm.
Half of the white oaks yielded only 10%. That means the other
Yeah.
half produced 90%.
Yeah, and I remember I don't know if it's written in that paper, but I remember it and, like, vividly in my head. I was working with Michael McCord, the other graduate
Hmm.
student. I was focused on deer, and he was focused on turkeys, but we worked together on everything. Uh, we were trying to figure out, okay, if we went in and we did it well, where we cut that half of the trees down, how long would it take based on the rate of expansion of canopy and the increase in flower production on the remaining good trees that we
Hmm.
left? How long would it take us to get to more mass being produced than before we cut half of the oaks down?
Right.
Have you ever heard me say that?
No,
Was it in that paper when you looked at it? Because I
I
don't know
didn't
if we
catch it.
put it in there. Uh, it was 2 years.
Mm.
So based on how fast we expected the canopies to expand by cutting down half of the trees, we projected, now we can't prove that, but we projected that we could cut down half of the trees if we cut down those poor half.
Mm-hmm.
We would actually have more mast being produced in 2 years than we had before we cut any oaks down.
So in 2 years, you go to having more acorn production, and you likely have better nesting, brooding, cover, and more deer forage on the ground.
Yes,
And not just deer forage during fall and winter, deer forage year round.
that's right. So you'd get and you increase mass production and soft mast as well
Yeah, sure.
substantially.
Yeah.
Like sometimes orders of magnitude more.
That's an easy sell.
Pretty solid sale, and you made some money off of that timber. you know, it's a
Hopefully.
pretty good deal.
Hopefully.
So we're going to get a lot into the weeds of managing oaks, but I find that's what kind of really blew me away was that stats. Like, oh my
Mm-hmm.
gosh, we could cut down half of the oaks and have more mast and all the other benefits of the timber harvest.
Yeah.
And that was eye-opening for me in particular because we kind of have this pervasive approach, just like a custodial approach to managing oaks. If
Absolutely.
you've got oaks, you just don't touch them.
Yeah.
That's the place you don't touch.
Preserve, don't conserve.
That's right. And that's one of the things that was so eye-opening to me about this study is, man, you could get in there and cut down half of them, and you don't actually even you don't lose mass production, you gain it.
You gain it in 2 years.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
crazy. So I don't know that 2 years is the mark. I would love to do that study,
Yeah.
but that's what we projected.
Yeah. And wasn't it that McCord study that reported that that increasing canopy size can increase acorn production by up to 65%?
No, that's the
That's
follow-up to
Brooke.
this.
Okay.
Yeah, Brooke et al. Michael McCord is an author on it with me as well because we were out there collecting the first several years of data.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so basically in the follow-up to this study, we actually went in and did a canopy release around trees.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what I mean there, any tree that was interacting with the canopy of our target oak, we removed it, killed it. And when we did that, you can expect that individual tree that was released to increase production on average about 65%.
Yeah. It's impressive.
So, which part of that is that canopy expansion, and part of it may be related to other factors as well.
Cool. Well, I had, this one other study that I included in the notes for today, but it makes a lot of the same points that we've already gone over, and we're already getting, close to an hour here. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know if you wanted to go ahead and wrap this up today and talk about it. Sounds like, we've got at least 2 more episodes on this topic coming up, with one focusing specifically on, what hardwood forests mean to turkeys.
Mm-hmm.
And not only from the acorn perspective, but I figure we'll get into some other aspects of that as well. And then wrapping up with 1 or more episodes specifically on managing hardwood forests for turkeys.
Yeah, I'm good with that. I think in the next episode, I really want to talk about how important oaks are to the vital rates of turkeys too.
Right.
So I'm kicking around a little bit and just warning you, coming with it.
Got the knowledge bombs. They're gonna be
Yeah,
flying.
I mean that's ultimately what everybody cares about, right? Like,
Yeah.
Okay, well, we understand mass is important. Here's how you manage for mass. Blah 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 blah. What does that mean for turkeys? That's what we need to get to.
Absolutely. All right. That was good stuff, man.
Yeah, really good. So, any other closing points you want to make? I know you took some diligent notes there. It's good looking stuff.
You know how I do. Well, you didn't have to take notes because you're the one that did most of the stuff.
Well, I participated in some of it.
But
Katie Greenberg has done so much
oh
good
yeah,
stuff with it.
Yeah.
You know, the burning acorn study
Yeah.
was a follow-up to her. She did a burning study to see how it affected germination rates,
Mhm.
which was really interesting stuff, and, of course, it
Yeah.
negatively affects, germination, but only when they're at certain places in the
Mhm.
leaf litter,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting, but,
Right.
you know, when you couple her data with mine or Mariah's, I should say, uh, from that study, ultimately, you might actually gain germination from burning.
Mm. That's cool.
So,
Well, I'll
anyway.
have a time to talk about some of my work when we get into the management part.
Oh, yeah.
I
No,
left the I
that was
left the
not
acorn counting to you.
Yeah.
I just
Well,
cut them up and burn them.
yeah. Hey, well, that's an important part of it, and, your study is definitely something that we need to talk about.
Yeah, and I think, I guess we could just talk about this briefly as like a little teaser what's coming up. But I think the significance of that work, and it was done by, I should give credit where it's due, Mark Turner, when he was here doing his master's before he went up to work on his PhD with Craig Harper at Tennessee. But there were a lot of folks that, looked at that data on using FSI and fire in mid South upland hardwood stands, and they thought, well, that's something that's unique to their situation. That'll never work down here in the coastal plain,
Mhm.
and so that's kind of
Yeah.
why we decided to tackle it, see what happens
Well,
down
I
here.
mean, that's exactly the kind of stuff that we need to be doing.
Yeah,
Somebody comes up with something really good somewhere, and then you start to see if it applies elsewhere.
yeah,
And, then next time you come up with something really good and you see if it translates.
yeah. And I mean, the argument against it was a good one, and they said, in a lot of our hardwood stands, we've got these thin-skinned water oaks that dominate the canopy, and that's where most of our acorn production is. You're just going to burn all them up. So
Mhm.
we'll talk about whether that did or did not occur.
Yeah. Well, we should, also I have a couple of tidbits from our ongoing study, which includes water oak in it, that I think will
Good.
be
Because
fun
you're right,
fodder.
there's almost nothing out there about water oak masting, and as soon as you've got that stuff, I'm going to incorporate it into my class because it's such an important mass producer
Yeah.
down here.
Yeah, and, like, find a study that has salt or, swamp chestnut.
Yeah, or laurel oak.
Yeah. There's nothing. It's crazy to me, but, it's dominating a lot of the stands down here,
Yeah.
so it's major importance here to understand, so
All right,
alright.
guys. Well, we hope you
Yeah,
enjoyed that. Hope you learned something, and hope we tease the upcoming episodes sufficiently to pique your interest, and we'll see you back.
yeah. Well, I hope they did enjoy it. It probably was one of the episodes least focused on turkeys that we've done.
Might be. Maybe that how to science episode would be an exception to that, although we talked about turkey research in that one too.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, we put out a call for episode ideas and asked if people would like more of those, like, kind of non-turkey focused, like the how to science one. And I got a couple of messages, I don't know if you did too, from people saying that they were interested in us expanding into that occasionally too.
Cool. No, I
So,
didn't get any messages related to that. Did on a few other things, but not that. So, yeah, that's good stuff. I'm glad folks are staying interested, and that also is validating to us that going into stuff like this oak masting might carry a lot of interest with our audience. So it's good to know.
so tell your deer hunting buddies. There's something to be learned on wild turkey science.
We are dependent on our audience at this point to help us spread the word to other people to grow. Yeah. Well, can't stress enough how much I appreciate the audience. Thanks everybody out there for listening. We really appreciate everything, and we're gonna keep going, keep chugging along.
Absolutely. Thank y'all.
See y'all next time.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.